Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue the journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yael HaKoyen Khan Olav Hashalom. And it is in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel HaKoyen and Risha Katz Le'erich Yomim V'shonim Tevis, for many long healthy years. So we're in the middle of Perek Daled, chapter 4 of Tanya. And the theme is levushim, the garments. I received quite a few questions to further explain this seemingly perplexing statement where the Alter Rebbe says, after explaining that the divine soul also has three garments, machshava, dibur, ma'aseh, thought, speech, and action, which are malbish, levushim, garments to what? They enclothe and manifest all Torah and mitzvahs in the language right in the beginning of Perek Daled, as the Alter Rebbe says. So all Torah and mitzvahs is expressed through thought, speech, or action, or a combination thereof. And that is the way the Nefesh Elokis manifests itself, not just its identity of being a divine soul, as explained in chapter 2, not only in addition to its faculties, I should say, which is meichen and midas, that its mind, its cognitive and its emotional faculties are completely absorbed with and saturated with godliness, contemplating on God, and bringing it into emotions, into feelings of ava and yira, love and reverence, and the rest of the emotions. But also the garments now are fully expressing these Torah and mitzvahs, as the Alter Rebbe explained in the beginning of chapter 4. But then comes the next section, where the Alter Rebbe uses and says these powerful words. V'hine shleisha levushim elu mahateru mitzvah. Now these three garments, which are from Torah and mitzvahs, which has two meanings, that the garments are now manifesting, they're enclothing Torah and mitzvahs. And the garments are the garments that come from Torah and mitzvahs. From Torah and mitzvahs. So he says, Av shenikroim levushim lenefesh ruach uneshama, even though they're called garments. So the Alter Rebbe is clearly qualifying. He understands that we're talking about garments. Which a garment, initially, ostensibly, is not on the same level as the body upon which the garment is covering or dressing. In this case, the garment of the neshama is only a garment of the neshama. Nevertheless, af shenikroim levushim, says the Alter Rebbe, im kol zeh, nevertheless, gova v'godla ma'ilosem la'ein kates v'seif al ma'ilus nefesh ruach u'neshama atzman. That nevertheless, they are infinitely greater on level and quality. It says two things, Godva, v'godla, greater, higher and greater, which Bapashta simply means quantity and quality, or a higher level, and also a qualitatively higher level, than the actual nefesh, ruach, and neshama. And he goes on to explain why, because these garments are garments now to haraisa, to Torah mitzvahs, and haraisa v'kudshe b'richu kol echad. So therefore the garments, which are now manifesting the Torah mitzvahs, which is kol echad with the Eibishter, that has a quality, gova v'godla, over the very neshama itself, the nefesh, ruach, neshama. So I explained in the last two shiurim, but especially last week, what does this mean? Alter Rebbe himself says even though it's only called garments, yet they're far greater. So I want to sum up what we discussed and go a little deeper into it and bring from the different Rabbeim Even the Alter Rebbe himself has a maimed where he explains this. But we have also from the Tzemach Tzedek, we have from the Rebbe, we have from the Rebbe Rashab, I should say first, the Rebbe, in that order. And also the other Rabbeim. So I'm going to try to do a synopsis of explaining this piece. Now, of course, the Tanya states it clearly, and he says, right away says, because but we learned in Perek Beis in Tanya earlier that Yisrael is chad with Kudsha Brichu. He doesn't use the word kul echad because, as we explained, there's no actual lashon like that. And the Rebbe says, even if there is, it doesn't mean the same chad. But he definitely says that chelika lekam imal mamish, vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, that God infuses a soul from the yipach, techiyusei, meprimiyusei, from his innermost self, so to speak, like a child to a parent, to a father, who comes from the very genetic material of the father. Not just like a student, a reflection of the teacher's intelligence, but the very genes and the DNA of the child are part of the father. Banim atem l'Hashem alekechem, children, your sons, your children of God, which comes from chachmasei, as he said, machshavti is baruch, from God's mind and thought, ola b'machshava, all these are the expressions in chapter 2, and chuv v'chachmasei echad, he said. And God is one with his chachmah. Literally what he's saying here. So what's the difference between the two? How do you say then that the levushim of Torah and mitzvahs is far greater, infinitely greater than the neshama itself, than the nefesh, ruach, and neshama? So though I explained it last week, I'm going to go over it again. It's worth going over because really the question is, to put it in more very blunt terms, if a neshama, if a soul is divine, and even as it's divine, even as it comes down to this earth, because that's the whole point. It's not just divine in heaven. Even as it comes down into our body, it retains its divine nature. It's the whole theme of chapter 2. Even neshamas that are not the highest neshamas that go into the category, as he says, of akfayim. What's akfayim? The heel. And even neshamas, he said, Paishi Yisrael, people who defy and go against the leaders of the generation, they all continue to receive the energy through Chachmah, through those leaders, going straight to receiving from Chachmasiyas Baruch, from the Father. The child always remains part of the Father, even the tzipor naim, even its toenails. So then what do you need Torah mitzvahs for? Now, I know it's a klotz kasha, and I'm not trying to suggest we don't, but what's the beer? What's the explanation? So in essence, that's really what we're discussing here. Because till now, he was talking about the divine soul. We talked about his faculties, contemplating on godliness, on mamal kalam, seviv kalam, and how God fills existence, how God transcends existence, and kula kamei kalochash, about everything is nullified before him, and that in turn stimulates yira b'moyach, a certain reverence in the mind, and then it travels to the heart, to the emotions. And then we learned in the beginning of this chapter, as I stated at the beginning of this class, that the levushim are saturated with his Torah mitzvahs, so the entire being of the divine soul, all the way to its very expression through thought, speech, and action, is all about godliness. And now we're trying to understand, so what does Torah mitzvahs actually add to the neshama? You have to say it does, because without it, the neshama can't actualize its divinity, even though it's fundamentally a neshama and a chelik alikam mamash. So this is addressed firstly by the Rabbeim themselves, and then Chassidim, as they explain Tanya, based on these Maimorim of the Rabbeim. So I'll go over it. Some of it I've already stated, but I'll go over it in a more organized way, step by step, the different explanations that come to explain this, all obviously in understanding this piece in Tanya. Because afterwards he goes into Arichas what Taka Torah is. And briefly, and that's critical before we get into this explanation how the Levushim are higher, is because Torah is Yaraisa v'Kudsha Brichu Kul Echad. Torah is not just rooted in the divine, but Torah continues to manifest godliness, God's will and God's wisdom. So even as the Torah comes down to earth, it always remains connected forever, Chad, with Eibishter. This is what the Eibishter wants. Like he says, it's Evorit de Malka, mitzvahs. They're actually, so to speak, like limbs of the king. The child of the king is not a limb of the king. So neshama is taka chelik and bekal mamish, like a child is a piece of his father, but he's not an extension of his father's body. Same thing in the nimshal, in the moral, that a child is, yes, a manifestation of the divine essence. Chachmoshe is baruch. Baruch is in the language of Chassidus, elokus shenase yesh. And this is critical. It's elokus, but nase yesh, it manifests in a state of an identity. Torah, you'll never see the expression elokus nase yesh. Yes, Torah will manifest, as we shall learn inside, in language, in understanding, in words, in statement, sfarim, diyei al gabe klaf, meaning ink and parchment, in physical form, so we should be able to understand it. But the Torah always remains Torah. Al derech, what it says in Chassidus is the difference between Oyer Ein Sof and the Nivroim, and a Nivra, a creation, a Yesh. Oyer Ein Sof, like light of the sun, never becomes detached from the source. The source disappears. The source is concealed, the light disappears as well. Oyer me'ein hamoyer. The oyer is similar to the source, and it's dovuk, it's attached, and there's no such thing as oyer, light, without its source. Now, there's no such thing as anything without God, but at least on a physical level, if the sun is covered or the sun is not there, the sunlight will not shine. Whereas creation was made in a way that even though the Ibishter is concealed, we still sense ourselves as an independent entity. And that's what's necessary, because if a neshama is like oyer and retains its light properties, it wouldn't be able to come down to this world and do Torah mitzvahs. Torah mitzvahs on the other hand, there's Torah eir, ner mitzvah v'Torah eir. It always remains a ner and a oyer, basically always connected to, always an expression of the king. Melech malchei hamlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's the first most important thing. So Torah mitzvahs basically are the tools, the divine tools were given to reveal the divine within the neshama and within the world around us. And that's the first thing. That explains the essential idea of why the levushim, as they're completely sublimated to and expressing garments of Torah mitzvahs, because we're talking about the divine soul, that's why God Levagava, because they're manifesting that achdus. You could say the ingilui, the ultimate revelation, and the direct and revealed unification with the Eibishter. So neshama in this world, putting in very simple terms, every person has a neshama. But God forbid if a person doesn't learn Torah and doesn't do a mitzvah, so the neshama remains dormant. Yes, Alpha Pishachati Yisrael, who, even though someone sins, the neshama remains intact. And every morning we say neshama shenasati b'tahirihi. And all that he said in chapter 2 is accurate. But it's like a flame, like a pilot flame that's not being fanned. It's not being expressed. So you'll say to someone, my neshama is perfect. I'm a Jew at heart. My soul is perfect. But I don't give charity, I don't do Avos Yisrael, don't do any other mitzvahs. Rahman al-Islam. What does that mean? That means the neshama remains a neshama, but it's not fulfilling the purpose for which it was created. And that's exactly the kavan. Elokus shenase yesh. It comes into the world of yesh, first of all, as an identity. Then it enters into a body and an animal soul. And now you need to reveal your divinity. And the Torah mitzvahs is the way we do it. How do you ignite? How do you fan the flames of the Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the flame of God, which is the soul of a human being? How do you do it? Through Ner Mitzvah V'Torah. You need a match. You need a pilot flame. So the wick is there. The flame is even burning in the pilot level within us. Ani yeshena v'li be'er, that even though I'm asleep, my heart is awake. The Torah mitzvah ignites it. So when a person, whether it's Torah, Vedic, Milos Chasadim, or any mitzvah, you ignite that neshama. And hence the chapter 2 is talking in Tanya about the very nature of the neshama. And chapter 4, what we're learning now, is about the levushim of Torah mitzvahs, where we use our thought, speech, and action. Not just that it's in our mind the potential to learn Torah. Your mind could learn Torah. Or the mind has even learned, but you're not actively doing it right now. But your thought, your speech and action are filled, sated, completely filled with Torah mitzvahs. And that, in that sense, is even greater and higher than the nefesh ruach neshama itself. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that even Lamaila, not just when the neshama comes down below Nasi Yesh, we say chelik elikam imal mamish. You don't say on Teira chelik of Raisa v'Kutcha chelik of Kutcha Brichu. Raisa v'Kutcha Brichu kul achad. So yes, you say chachu v'chachmase echad, but at the end of the day, the neshama comes through, even in its source, it's rooted in the etzem, and it's only nimshach from moiche u'machshavte, meaning it flows through it, but it does flow through it, and it's called chelik. So the chelik is like chelik asher tefes. It says etzem kasher tefes bechelke to tefes bekule. A core entity, when you grasp even a part of it, miktzis or chelke part or a piece of it, you grasp it all, but you still call it a chelik. Teira, on the other hand, is one with the Eibishter in its root. That's not to find a chelik. It's an expression of all of godliness. Now, obviously, the Eibishter is higher than Teira. The Eibishter is higher than everything. But the connection, the unity, even in the root, is also in that deeper level. Third point to make. The language here, he says, that is Gova, v'godlam alosam le'en kates v'seif, he doesn't say ala neshama alone. He says al mailas nefesh ruach neshama atzmon. He specifically uses nefesh ruach neshama. We know there's also chay yechid, etzem neshama. He doesn't necessarily say here that levushim is higher than chay yechid. He doesn't say the other way either. But you could see nefesh ruach neshama, which means as the neshama is already manifesting in our conscious faculties, that we know nefesh ruach neshama, as we discussed in Perek Beis, is what nefesh focuses mostly in the the behavioral. Nur ruach is the midas, the emotional, chesed gvura teferes, and neshama is moichin chabad chachma bin adas, the cognitive. What about the higher levels of the neshama? So you could say that the Alter Rebbe is talking by saying nefesh ruach neshama. He's not saying it's necessarily higher than that. Which brings me to Tzemach Tzedek, a Maimer in Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek says, he asks a question on this Tanya. He says, here it says that the levushim of Torah mitzvahs are higher than the nefesh ruach neshama atzma. Another place he brings from the Kutei Torah, from the Alter Rebbe, that you see the neshamas are higher than Torah. The point they're mashpia in Torah. So how do you reconcile it? So he says, look at another Maimer, Kutei Torah, Shir Hashirim, Yenosi, where he says there are two levels of neshama. There's the neshama as it comes down below, nefesh ruach neshama. And there the Torah is higher. We need Torah to direct us, to guide us. Torah meloshen eirah. Without Torah, the neshama doesn't have direction in this world. Yes, fundamentally in its essence, as that Rambam writes in Hilchos second, at the end of the second chapter in Hilchos Gerushin, he says indeed that why Yitzrei Husha Anseh, because every Jew wants to be'etzem do Torah and mitzvahs and wants to stay away from any Aveda, but that's be'etzem. You still need someone to educate you, to know what to do, even on a basic level. And for sure, Torah Eir, that illuminates the way, like we said before. Torah is mamshich. And Megala, the power of the neshama. That is nefesh ruach neshama, that level of neshama that's lower than Torah. But then there's a level of neshama that's higher than Torah, that's mashpia in Torah. That's what the Tzemach Tzedek says. So both, it's not a contradiction. It depends which one you're talking about. Which is consistent to everything we said till now. That basically in the Giluyim, or even Giluyim Atzmim, the Torah is critical because the Torah is Reisa v'Kudsha B'richu Kul Echad. And as the Rebbe explains in a note on Tanya, in one of the Rebbe's letters explaining this Tanya, to reconcile this, again, the second chapter, chapter 2 and chapter 4, that the Lashon is Reisa v'Kudsha B'richu Kul Echad. It doesn't say Yisrael v'Kudsha B'richu Kul Echad. There it says the Lashon miskasheron, kesher. And the Rebbe Rashab explains that kesher, a bond, a knot, is tying two things. In other words, they're separate, but they're tied together. Chad means they're like completely one, like a flame with another flame, completely one. And the Rebbe says, even if you'll find a source, he says, I haven't found a source where it says, in Zoyar, Yisrael v'Kudsha B'richu Kul Echad. Even if you find a source based on this Tanya, you have to say the Chad is different. The unity of the neshama with the Eibishter is different than the unity of the Torah. And they each, yesh b'zeh, ma she'ein b'zeh. Then we have the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe. In Sefer Maimori Admur HaZoken in Yonim, That's a collection of the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim on Inyonim, page 77 in the newer edition. He talks mamish about this. He literally talks about this. The Maimer begins the difference between Eris and Kalim and Levushim v'Gufim, between energies and containers and garments and bodies. And in the middle of the Maimer, he goes ahead and cites the Tanya. Because here remains somewhat of a question. Everything fine and good that we've said so far. That the Torah has a quality, which means here that the garments that are manifesting Torah mitzvahs is Godle v'Gova, my losam le'in case v'seif, far infinitely greater than the Nefesh Ruach and Neshama itself. But that is Torah mitzvahs. Like he's going to say afterwards, what about the garments themselves? You're saying the levushim are far greater. Not just that the fact that the levushim are manifesting Torah mitzvahs. So that's what he addresses in that maimer. And he says the following, that it's true that on one hand, Eris and Kalim seem to be far deeper connection. Eris and Kalim, like the power of vision in your eye. A garment and a body are more distant apart because a body can exist without a garment can exist without a body. Eir and Keli will not be completely functional without each other. Like a neshama beguf, like a soul inside of a body. On the other hand, levushim, he says, are rooted deeper in the etzem than Eris and Kalim, and also than the gufim themselves. And he gives an example from an example. When you explain an idea to a student, so you manifest it in Eres B'Kelim, the idea, and you express it in words. But sometimes you need to use a moshel, an example. Why? Because the student can't understand the very idea, so he needs a metaphor, an example, something that relates to him. A moshel is like a lavush. It's not necessary for the very idea, it's only in order to help the student understand it. So it's really more distant from the actual idea than a container of words is from the Eres. But the fact that you can put it into a garment, which is a dover zor, something outside of the very body of the idea, tells you that it's rooted in the etzem, in a deeper level. He explains it at length there. With that, you understand that yes, Torah mitzvahs has a milo over neshamis that we discussed. But now there's also one more thing, even the garments. So number one, because they're garments to Torah mitzvahs, that makes them higher because they have nothing else but expressing thought, speech, and action of Torah mitzvahs. But in addition to that, we also have that the very garments, see the diuk of the Alter Rebbe, that even the garments themselves have something, and he compares it similar to the fact that Torah mitzvahs has something from that etzem that's higher than the nefesh ruach neshama as it comes down below and separates, so to speak. Not elakusha nasi yesh. That also the garments also have an element from a deeper source. There are more Maimorim from the Alter Rebbe that talk about garments, because on one hand, garments seem, like he says right here, seem to be externals. Afshe nikroim levushim. Interesting, he calls them nikroim levushim. They're called garments, because that's how they manifest. But their root is actually from a deeper place that gives them the power to manifest Torah mitzvahs, or like the example, a moshel, you need to be wiser, like Shlomo Amel, to give an example, you need to have a better understanding of the very idea of a person who can't find an example and can't explain it and bring it down to that level. So that he adds the diuk of levushim. And one final point, which is also from the Tzemach Tzedek, where he says, in asking this question, how could you say Torah mitzvahs is higher? The levushim of Torah mitzvahs is higher than the nefesh ruach neshama, and milas nefesh ruach neshama atzman. So he brings that it says in the Maimorim that Torah mitzvahs is rooted in keser. In Perek Beis in Tanya, he says the neshama is rooted in chokhmah. Well, I should correct, it's rooted in higher than chokhmah. But nimshachim, it travels through chokhmah. It doesn't say keser. Keser is ratzon elyon. Keser we know is higher than chokhmah, which is consistent to the explanation that in the two ways, whether Torah is higher than neshamas or neshamas are higher than Torah. So in this context, Torah has an element of keser. And keser is mamshich keser, the ratzon Hashem, the will of God, into chokhmah. Now we know Torah is also chachma sheyizbarach. He's saying it clearly. Torah is wisdom. So first of all, mitzvahs is more the ratzon, because mitzvahs is a sheker d'shana b'mitzvahs v'tzivanu, the commandments of God. There's also the Ratzon Hashem. In the Torah, God is revealing His Ratzon. What does He want from us? Torah also has Kesed as it comes into Chachma. Our Ratzon manifests in wisdom, and that's the learning of Torah, which is going to be the continuation of the discussion in Tanya here. That we can understand and comprehend the incomprehensible God through Torah. A neshama cannot do that because a neshama is rooted in the etzem, but it's not, and it goes through chachmas yisbarach, but it doesn't retain, even though a neshama has divine wisdom in it, but in a revealed way it needs to learn Torah. Even the greatest neshamas, and even though we learn the entire Torah in our mother's womb, you still need to learn. Even the greatest Geonim, you need to learn to so-called reawaken and reveal the Torah that is embedded in our superconscious, either during our mother's, being lamdim Torah b'mei imay, that we learned the entire Torah in our mother's womb, or the Torah as the neshama knows it from above, from heaven. But to bring it alive, you need the keser coming into chachma. The neshama is rooted in chachma, but as we discussed at length, all the differences between that and Torah. So I hope this helped explain this very critical piece and really puts into context the role that each part of what are the gifts we have in life. In the beginning of Tanya, he said that from Masechta Nida, Seif Perek Gimel Masechta Nida, the first words in Tanya, that what? That Mashbiya Neisei Tehit Tzadik V'al Tehi Rasha, that every child, every newborn, every soul that comes to this world is given an oath to be a tzaddik and not be a rasha. We explain Mashbiyin is also from the word V'savota, Mazbiyin, to sate, to fill, to feed, to nourish. So every neshama is nourished with that. But that's not enough. How do you bring that alive? You need Torah and mitzvahs. So in a way, if you think about it, the whole structure of Tanya is leading us, because that's what the Alter Rebbe is coming to explain. What is a neshama? And now he's talking about the very identity of a neshama, then the faculties of the neshama. Then we come to the garments, and we see the garments are not just garments. Yes, garments are critical for expression, but the very garments of Torah and mitzvahs is Godla v'gova me'id, or the words of Godla v'gova ma'ilosam, I should say, le'ein kates v'seif. Alter Rebbe even named ein kates v'seif. He could have just said Godla v'gova v'godla ma'ilosam. I don't know, that's already a chiddush. He says, without end. Ein kates v'seif, double. He says, ein kates v'seif. That means there's something here that's so awesome and so extraordinary different. And now we understand why. Because Torah Mitzvahs introduces the whole thing, which also explains the chiddush of Matan Torah. Neshamas are neshamas. Why is Matan Torah such a big thing? Because you're getting the Torah, Araisa v'kudsha b'richu kul echad, the Keser, the Ratzon, and all the qualities that we've discussed, to empower the neshama. Because remember, a Torah Mitzvah without a neshama, you also, what do you have? So the neshama now, empowered by Torah Mitzvahs, can transform this world. So with that, we're going to conclude, even though we didn't learn anything inside further, but I think it was necessary to explain it this way. So everyone have a very good tavach, and please go to TanyaApply.com, where you can find all these archives and ask questions. Be well, be blessed. Kol Tuv.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.